I'll almost take it to like an American dynamism perspective where if we don't solve housing, we can't be a superpower. You just can't, right? Like that is the fundamental Maslow's hierarchy of needs need, right? It's shelter, food, et cetera. It's at the bottom of the chart. So it's something we have to solve. But generally, we're underbuilding. Our thesis as to why we're underbuilding, and a lot of folks can argue that it's bureaucratic.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today, I'm speaking with Aleks Gampel, co-founder at Cuby Technologies. Aleks, thanks for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We've been friends for a little bit, so this is exciting.
I'm excited to chat, but before diving into the business, technology, the housing sector, talk to me about you. So growing up, why buildings? How'd you end up here?
Yeah, no, I'm an immigrant. I think you are too. We moved here when I was 8. I come from a real estate family, so I've really been around real estate my whole life. My mom likes to joke that whenever we walked streets when I was a kid, I was always looking at buildings, never looking forward. I like physical space. I think, a building is the backdrop to someone's life, where they live, where they work, where they play. So I've always found kind of four walls and where we spend most of our time intriguing. My path has been pretty nonlinear, but I started out in studying engineering and also have a degree in business, have worked in finance most of my career. So investing and developing real estate as opposed to building a company. But luckily, those worlds have begun to fuse. You and I both categorically live in the prop tech ecosystem, and those worlds started to fuse. So I've built a really interesting niche of knowing how to build, buy, invest in a building, but also how to build an operating business that sits on top of. After finance, I went on to work and help build operating businesses that were backed by venture that sit on top of real estate. So I've developed this weird niche that I think most people don't have, which is speaking both worlds really, really fluently.
I mean, talk to me about that for a little bit. So not everyone decides to start their own company. What ultimately kind of put you over the edge?
I think I always wanted to start my own business. Just it's not one of those things where like you sit down on a piece of paper and you decide this is what you want to start. It's like you again, right? You found the problem and you thought that serendipitously that point in time is the right time to solve it. For us, it was a little different, probably also nonlinear, but I have a partner in the business, Oleg Show. He's an incredible engineer. He's what most deep tech venture folks want to back when it comes to building really hard things. He's 20 years of building hardware and manufacturing businesses. So like he's an ace when it comes to that. But at the time, I went on to help build a real estate development business. We had product market fit in terms of the product we were building. Investors were willing to give us a lot of money to continue to scale that product. It was lowercase affordable. There was a lack of skilled labor in New York City. We were building around New York City. Physically could not hire enough construction workers. Those construction companies could not hire subcontractors, aka more workers. And I saw kind of this interesting opportunity to maybe be a progressive developer. Could I find an interesting way to build better? And I started interviewing through my venture ecosystem, whether it was software solutions, hardware solutions, like what could I deploy being that young developer that is willing to take risk on new ways to build or more efficient ways to build that would help alleviate some of those skilled labor issues or lack of skilled labor. And I couldn't be a customer of anything. Like either these hardware companies, let's call them industrialized construction, whether it was volumetric modular, refabrication, 3D printing, I kind of did not explore given the product we were building, but not very bullish there necessarily. But I couldn't be a customer. Those reasons were either these companies I didn't think would survive. They didn't understand what I was solving for, didn't speak real estate, highly inefficient. They weren't cost effective. Like there was just many reasons why it was a red flag for me to be a customer. As part of that search, this was about 3.5 years ago, I met my co-founder who I just described. Oleg was, interestingly, in Eastern Europe, had about 200 engineers full time, and it was time for them to expand their headquarters. He started working with a general contractor and developer. He wanted to build a spec new office industrial design park. And that experience of like working with a GC and a developer versus his domain expertise, which is lean manufacturing, is what he's written books on. Those are two polar opposite worlds. So he was forced to build in the space given his expertise and like the misaligned incentive he saw on the other end. So he said, I'm going to commit the next 40 years of my life to solving this because I know how. I met him at about 50,000 engineering hours of him starting to build in this space. And the thesis he pitched me was very well aligned with what I saw didn't work with what I was trying to use as a customer. So we kind of met at that inflection point, and I was more the commercializing force. He was more of the technical force. And we partnered, and for 3.5 years, embarrassingly, I spend more time with Oleg than my wife. So
Help us zoom out for a second. So for a listener, on the subject of housing, at this point, we all know it's a challenge. We all know that housing prices are going high, but zoom out for a second. What have we gotten wrong till now?
let's take like a massive step back and not harp on it too much. So there's obviously a housing crisis, which leads to an affordability crisis. We know this because every other week, every tabloid has that as a headline article. If you take a step back beyond that, right, it's just a function of us underbuilding. So the most housing we've ever built was post World War II. Just built a lot of the same thing, copy and paste. We were really good at it. And we kind of stopped building. And post 2008, we've stopped building as well, which is generally the supply demand gap between what needs to be built versus where we need to be building today. It's just at an imbalance. Therefore, there's a housing crisis in terms of affordability. And it's gotten really bad. I would say, from what I've seen, 50% of the US market can't afford a $250,000 home, which you and I living in New York City seems crazy, probably just given where our price points are. And also about 50% of the US is rent burdened substantially, meaning they're spending way more than 30% of their income on rent. So it's a really bad problem. And I'll almost take it to like an American dynamism perspective where if we don't solve housing, we can't be a superpower. You just can't, right? Like that is a fundamental Maslow's hierarchy of needs need, right? It's shelter, food, et cetera. It's at the bottom of the chart. So it's something we have to solve. But generally, we're underbuilding. Our thesis as to why we're underbuilding, and a lot of folks can argue that it's bureaucratic, right? Like it takes a long time for a developer to actually get permits to go build, or what they're allowed to build is highly regulated. Yes, that's part of the problem. We think the problem lies more in the fact that young people like you and I don't want to be construction workers swinging a hammer. And that's evident because if you look statistically, we're missing a massive portion of the required workforce, so physical hands to go swing hammers on construction sites. It's getting so bad that in about 10 years, 40 to 50% of that workforce is going to retire. So imagine this growing gap between supply and demand, but now we have even every year less and less people to actually go build those homes. So our thesis is very much predicated on solving one thing, and it's how do we build more homes with less hands, less skilled hands, particularly. So that's the systems we're building is essentially to solve around the skilled labor deficit. That's our one sole KPI.
Let's compare and contrast for a moment. So perhaps let's use speed of construction today. Where are we versus where do you envision kind of building a system to get faster?
So just so your, I guess, listeners, maybe not all of them know what happens when a home gets built. There's Bob Smith, developer, home builder. Bob Smith, developer, buys a piece of land. Bob Smith, developer, needs to hire a third party, several third parties, everything from architects to local engineers to essentially submit what they want to build to a local township to get approvals to actually be able to build. Then that developer is hiring a general contractor who's overseeing the build, who then hires subcontractors who help execute. And right now, it's a very disjointed, fragmented process. For a single family home, which is not a complicated space, it's not like your background and all the complications in commercial real estate or, large multifamily, et cetera. Single family home is fairly simple, but even so, it takes anywhere from 7 to 12 months, sometimes 14 months to build a single family house. And it takes 22 different subcontractors, sometimes less, sometimes more. It's an incredibly disjointed process. Our target, and we can talk about what we're doing, is essentially to be able to, for context, build a home with no subcontractors, no GCs. We want to be doing that function as a unified organ, as a solution to home builders. We want to be able to build homes in about 30 days, as opposed to, on average, 8 months. The other important piece is building a home today is fairly expensive. Like it is expensive to build a home, and it goes back to that skilled labor gap. So when you build a house, for every dollar that you spend on building it, 60 to 70% of that cost is a labor cost. So to the extent you can bring down the labor cost by A, spending less labor hours, but B, de-skilling from the skilled labor that's required to build a home, you can substantially bring down the cost. I think the average statistic is, I think it's from 2021 I don't think they have an updated one. Maybe they do, but I guess in 2021, 2022, the average cost to build a home was around $156 a foot. That number is way incorrect. It was skewed down by the top 10 home builders, who are these publicly traded home builders that build tens and thousands of homes a year, meaning that number does not equate to Bob Smith, the home builder that's building somewhere in Calabasas, California. That number I'd say today for Bob Smith, the home builder, is somewhere around 185, 200, sometimes more per foot on a quality product of a home. This is not even adding the equation of quality. Like today's single family homes are pieces of crap. They really are. They're not climate resistant. They wear and tear very easily, meaning there's no durability, hence you have high insurance policies. And it's funny and ironically, we have a lot of engineers sitting in Eastern Europe. When they see like the stuff that Lennar builds, they laugh because no one would live in that in Europe ever. Like a stick built, typical, suburban home in America is not by any means a quality home. To other countries, that's perceived as like affordable housing. We're talking about houses that are $800,000, $1 million. Anyway, I deviated quite far. But again, everything to go back to the fact that what we're trying to solve is really around skilled labor and reducing that skilled labor. And we think that solves everything else.
Are there limitations around that? So in other words, I know that today we have architectural systems, carpentry systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems. How do you think about that? When you double click into the building itself, it's all the parts, pieces, and systems. You're facing regulatory, you're likely facing skilled, unions that likely aren't ecstatic about this. But how do you approach the different systems and maybe breaking down between like carpentry, electrical, plumbing, et cetera? How do you think about that?
So when a home gets built, generally there's different stages to building a home. Those stages correspond to inspectors showing up on site, meaning public organs to essentially say, hey, this is okay and allowed. Because for your audience, you can't, in context, just go build a house, a log cabin somewhere that you decided to build with some shady materials you found somewhere and did it yourself. There are regulatory bodies that ensure that you're building up to a certain code compliance that ensures the building is safe, that your neighbors are safe, that folks entering the building, et cetera. So when you build a building, it's generally staged. You start with the foundation, then you frame a home, then you enclose the home, then you start working on your MEP, mechanical, electric, plumbing, like you start to get from a piece of land all the way to a finished home where you're starting to put in things like furniture, which I constitute as like kitchen cabinetry. During those stages, an inspector shows up and checks boxes off. There's about 5 stages. Yes, typically because there's 22 subcontractors, some of the subcontractors are very specific, highly skilled functions, like installing your HVAC, like doing the electrical work. Taking a step back, a lot of folks have tried to industrialize construction, which is where we play, which is how do you take away those functions? How do you make a home the same way that, say, Toyota makes a car in Toyota's production system? Our thesis starts out with the following. It's really threefold. We don't believe that's possible unless A, you bring the factory closer to site. Historically, folks have tried to launch these gigafactories that make either all or some components of a home. To answer your question, when you're some components of a home, it's hard to take away those subcontractor functions. So anyways, thesis number one for us is more of a decentralized, distributed network of smaller CapEx factories, meaning we can launch them near to where construction is happening. Our second big bet is around not changing the end product. That goes back to what you're saying. We're not big fans of using alternative materials. We're not big fans of pre-cladding, meaning like creating some sort of panel where all the MEP already lives in the panel and arrives on site ready to go. We're not big fans of changing what a home is. The reason being is you start to run into low adoption risk, meaning home builders are conservative. As soon as you start changing what a home is, you really deviate far from adoption. 2, because of those regulatory bodies, as soon as you start to do things different and out of norm, you start to run into red tape around regulation, which, we don't want to be a biotech company. It's tough tough as it is to try to solve what we're solving. So we're trying to do everything on site, localized in the way it's been done, just a bit of a different process delivery mechanism. And the third bet is around cost. You have to create value for incumbents, otherwise they will not come. If you are a more expensive, over-engineered solution, that's not how developers think. You and I know developers are cost sensitive, that all they think about is yield on cost. They don't spend dollars that they don't need to. So if you can't be cheaper than, or at least at cost parity than existing home builders, you're irrelevant. So going back to your question, we're trying to solve this by being a full end-to-end solution. So industrializing the full end-to-end solution of building a home. We bring a mobile microfactory near to where there's construction demand for single-family homes. And inside that mobile microfactory, we make components, meaning we take raw input and make things like windows, like helical piers for the foundation system, framing elements, panels that enclose the home, we call them SIP panels. So we'll make raw inputs. Everything else is off the shelf, like a kitchen cabinet or toilets or sheetrock, but we're prepping those elements. Then we take 1 and 2, stuff we made and stuff that's prepped, put it on a pallet and send it literally last mile to where the construction is happening. And it's our unskilled labor that's putting it together. So using our software and our process, we've taken out all the specialty functions and we're able to do it end to end. Kind of a long-winded answer, but it's not as simple to answer as kind of you're expecting the answer to be.
It helps paint the picture. I think from your perspective, who do you think is the customer with the least amount of friction? Is it other construction firms, the developers themselves? Is it the kind of direct to consumer home buyers? Who do you see has kind of is just organically embracing it?
We have a master plan and it's divided into 4 chapters. I don't cover, 2, 3, and 4, but we'll cover 1. We've built a tool. This tool is a mobile microfactory. That is our product. And the way to think about it is it's the system that can build many, many homes in many different markets. And we want this tool to be as accessible to local operators as possible. The best analogy I can give is maybe McDonald's. It's probably my favorite because it's so far from what we do. But in a sense, it's very applicable. McDonald's has spent hundreds and thousands of hours designing a system, call it hardware, call it software, call it processes, supply chain, hiring standards, whatever. They've built a system to be able to copy and paste what ultimately is their product, which is an F&B outlet that makes repeatable food. But they're able to give it in the hands of local operators who can run it super, super efficiently. We've essentially done the same thing. We're not targeting 49,000 factories, but we are targeting about 200 plus mobile microfactories across A, the US, but B, other first world countries where labor is a big issue. And we want to give this system to local operators. When you ask about our customer, today our customer is anyone that sees value in what we've productized, which is a system, and is willing to front $10 million or some portion of those $10 million to launch that system in their local market. Those groups look like private equity groups. They look like highly capitalized home builders, developers. They look like ultra high net worth families, just anyone that sees value in running a profitable manufacturing business in the local market, whose product is single family homes. The factory, once it's launched locally, it services a 150-mile radius and it's servicing small to medium sized home builders. That's who our customer is. Bob Smith, the home builder that's in some locale building 20 to 30 homes a year, we're this turnkey solution for him to build a home without having to deal with GCs and subs. Like, give us the designs, we'll do everything from foundation to interior finish, meaning the local factory will.
I want to dive into financing, but really quick to stay on the subject. For students of history, housing as a product is not a new subject, right? We've got kind of a spectrum of different approaches from prefab to container homes. How does perhaps the person looking to learn more understand the nuances to like where we've been, what we've tried, what's worked, what maybe hasn't worked, and like where we are today?
So let's start with traditional construction and how a home gets built. So today's construction processes, the way home building works today is it's pretty much a one-off project every time. You can have one lot next to another lot building the same exact home by the same crew, backed by the same people. Those 2 homes will come out different. That's how construction works today. And obviously that is not representative to how everything else from your shirt to the car you drive get made, right? In a factory setting or some sort of industrialized lean manufacturing approach. How odd would it be if you bought a Toyota Camry and like the guy that bought one right after you, your 2 cars are different, things like that. Like that's the difference. So folks have been trying to industrialize construction now for a long time. Like the idea of prefab is not new. If you look at the Soviet Union, they had precast, which is a form of prefab. They would make these like giant, concrete walls that they would enclose, 9-story repeatable buildings. So it's not a new concept. We had levee towns in the US. Like you literally would be able to go into a Sears catalog. Sears used to literally sell kit of parts of homes. They would put them on a train, ship them to that locale. And there was essentially like distributors or builders that would put together those kit of parts. All of this has existed. It stopped existing because certain technologies advanced and certain policies have changed, et cetera. And like there needs to be a 21st century version of this. We think we're doing that. But what folks have done kind of categorically in industrialized construction, we break up into 3 segments. One, there's volumetric modular. Folks have seen like a crane literally loading up an entire living room on top of each other, right? You literally like have a 3D volumetric room, like this room as if it were produced in a factory, all in its entirety, wrapped around, put on a giant oversized truck and shipped to a site to be stacked on top. It could work well if there's maybe a hotel or student housing where you have highly repeatable same product over and over again. Stops working well when you talk about housing. Housing is disparate. So shipping thousands of these thousands of miles away is not efficient. Two, if you really step foot into a volumetric modular factory, there's not a lot of skilled labor reduction. It's really that same skilled labor swinging a hammer, just now not getting rained on. Plus, the capital expenditure to actually launch those factories is super high, which means the economics don't work so well, especially when you have ebbs and flows of real estate demand. So we're not believers that volumetric modular is necessarily a good solution for the millions of homes. I think there's $2 trillion worth of unmet housing demand that needs to be built. Second solution, prefab. That's probably where we fall into a bit more, even though we like to think we're like a combination of prefab and traditional construction, really. But prefab is Lego blocks. It's a good example. Imagine you were to deconstruct an entire building, produce some components or all components in some offsite manner in some gigafactory again, and ship those components on site to assemble. Tough because usually a third party assembles them. Typical GC doesn't really take away much. Still not cost effective in today's environment. Just many reasons we think it also hasn't worked, which I can honestly go into for like a whole hour. And the third is probably 3D printing that's picking up steam. 3D printing is a tough one. It's 10% of the home building process. It's just framing. It's not cost effective. It's too unfamiliar. Not one we're super bullish on. We think the right approach is really about creating a system that's extremely familiar and highly scalable. So we think we're neither of those three really. Although if we were to be placed in a category, it'd probably be more Lego blocks, but as if those Lego blocks were the same home that's being built today.
Right. You mentioned a kind of 4-part master plan. And obviously to get to that kind of promised land, right? Certain things need to be true at certain chapters of the business. But if you had a magic wand right now to change one thing, what needs to happen for you to get from point A to point B? I mean, forget the promised land. Just what is the next kind of thing that needs to change?
There's a lot of things in between chapter 1 and chapter 4. Chapter 4 in 10 years is there's 275 mobile microfactories humming in the background. With that scale, we then want to get to a point where we ultimately become a home builder and take certain fraction of demand from each of our mobile microfactories ourselves and build homes directly. I want Jose and, hopefully your first, second, third kid, you'll eventually need a bigger place to be able to go on our website and just like any other home builder, directly be able to design, build your home. And we already will have the back end for that to happen. But I think it starts with back end. I think it's very hard for folks that have tried to be direct to consumer home builders. It doesn't work unless you can effectively bring out cost and get to scale. There's a reason why there's not a lot of national home builders. It's incredibly freaking hard.
You mentioned earlier costs and financing and startup costs. You're in a very physical space, hardware, and we exist in a space where much of the innovation dollars for the last 10, 15, 20 years have been mostly spent on software. I do think that the pendulum is finally swinging towards recognizing that we live in a built environment that requires physical stuff to exist. I'm curious, what's been your experience in the financing market? It costs money to build what you're doing. It's not like two guys in a garage building a Angry Birds app and now it's available in the App Store. That's not your space. How do you finance this to make sure it's successful, especially when you're kicking it off?
I think obviously hardware historically, well, not historically. I think where Silicon Valley started out in hardware, and then we went really, really heavy into software. But I think once again, hardware and full stack businesses, meaning businesses that do everything in-house from hardware to software, execution, et cetera. In other words, vertically integrated. I think that's no longer a cliche. I think venture is starting to realize that software that sits on hardware is a lot more valuable. So the good thing is there's positive tailwinds and investors have been really excited to start backing again really difficult problems that require deep solutions that take time. I guess that's why it's called deep tech, right? A lot of engineering required up front, and that's where venture is really good. It's really good at backing R&D. That's why, a business like ours doesn't go straight to a lender or private equities because lenders and private equity don't take R&D risk. That being said, to do what we're doing required I guess I'll say up to now about 350,000 engineering hours. To give your audience context, it takes 700,000 engineering hours to build a fighter jet. So it is a lot of upfront man hours to get to a certain technology readiness level that effectively allows you to commercialize. I think if we came day one to investors, I guess Oleg and I are not former founders of Airbnb or whatnot, right? So like not the type of track record publicly that would allow an investor to say, hey, here's 50 million bucks to go R&D and get to proof of concept. We couldn't do that. So instead, in order to mitigate costs, I'd say we've mitigated 7 to 10x cost. We've set up massive manufacturing and R&D, and all of our engineers sit in Eastern Europe. That's a massive cost reduction. It's hard to do that. A, you have to be culturally from there, which we luckily are. Two, you have to have one of two or three or four co-founders or whoever is leading the technical charge, be one of the co-founders. You can't outsource R&D or innovation or IP. Everything inside the factory, every piece of process came from Oleg's brain. It is all him. So he can delegate tasks versus outsource. Like you can't outsource what you're coming up with. But it's worked really effectively for us. We've needed to raise much less capital. I'd say like the capital we've raised with the amount we've done is pretty unprecedented for a deep tech company in today's world. And, we're now ready to get commercial. We've launched our first mobile microfactory in Eastern Europe. It's building homes. We've tested our technology. We know where we're coming at, and we're starting to commercialize by putting our factories out into the US, meaning we're signing contracts and, 12 to 24 months, there'll be several of these in operation in the US. I think we're doing a venture round now. It's still small relative to folks kind of at our level of commercialization, but it'll probably be the last equity we raise. Our business is super well built for debt. We love correct cost of capital. Venture is not the correct cost of capital to go put out 275 factories in the world, but we're very conscious and aware of the right cost of capital, and that's what we're targeting going forward.
It wouldn't be a tech podcast if I didn't ask you about AI, but in your case, how do you internalize it? How both operationally, the end product, is it at all useful? Are you thinking about it? How do you incorporate this into your workflow?
I mean, just broadly speaking, I think AI is definitely interesting for real estate. Like we're seeing everything from like site selection using AI for developers. We're seeing everything from like automated engineering drawing sets that, historically would have required 250K line spend and a budget and development budget, but now can be fully automated. It's interesting what's happening. In our world, I think it's a later function. Like there are some elements of like our day to day, right? Like our software engineers, I'm sure, use AI to some extent, right? Day to day, yes, for sure. Where we want to get to is we want each mobile microfactory, given the scale we'll have and the reps we'll have, to eventually learn from itself how to optimize. So we right now up front are putting 70 cameras in each mobile microfactory to eventually pick up on what's going on from each station, each process, each subassembly, to eventually pick up on that. Aside from that, I mean, other things that AI is good for, I mean, even taking like 2D floor plans of a home and the built-in AI and things like Unreal Engine now to convert that to, a live rendering. I mean, not necessarily our AI function, but the tools we get to use have now all kind of embedded AI that's helpful. We're lucky. Our space is still yet to be highly disrupted by AI. There's still a lot of room to do things that are applicable from other industries that aren't kind of AI net positive.
On that, how do you think about the rising generation of labor? I mean, who is going to be trained? Do you envision a world where what you're suggesting is we're just kind of reading the writing on the wall? There will be less people in construction with skilled trades. Is that just kind of foregone conclusion? And from there, we just have to optimize for a leaner workforce to make this happen?
I think we need a more efficient workforce. When you envision a traditional construction worker, it's a guy with a beard. It's, generally a bigger guy. Like it's a heavy lift industry. There's a lot of strain on your body. Like it is a root industry. A lot of safety risks, a lot of issues that happen along the way, and one of the highest turns of any industry in terms of turnover. What we're trying to get to is we want to be able to take away that typical image of a construction worker, which generally takes years to apprentice. It's a highly skilled apprentice industry, like it's a skilled trade. We want to be able to go take a barista from Starbucks, train that individual for 2 weeks using Unreal Engine and some of the digital twins of our processes, like remotely, and have that person be able to execute a function, which by definition of like Toyota's production system, you break up steps so much so that you're able to execute those functions really efficiently. You can't move on to the next task. So like when we say unskilled, we mean unskilled relative to today's construction, but still there's some training involved, of course. Like I can't just throw you into our factory and you know what to do. Like there is some execution in between, but definitely not what typical skilled construction is today.
Regulation. How do you think about that? So, highly unlikely that you're going to be building or just dropping these buildings into New York City, right? And so, how do you think about the market? Or perhaps I'm wrongly defaulting to the US. You might be thinking about other countries, but what's the path of least resistance here? And how do you think about geography and regulation?
In terms of like expansion, we're highly focused on first world countries because that's generally where there's more white collar jobs than blue collar, or more white collar jobs in demand relative to blue collar. And that's where the cost equation for labor is the highest, which means that our value proposition or arbitrage we create in terms of value savings is the highest. So first world is definitely, I think, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, US, etc. Those are the most interesting. In terms of like regulation, I think that's a separate question. The way we designed the kit of, so really it was like, what is a home? What is it allowed to be? Then you back into the kit of parts that you can kind of deconstruct the home into, and then you choose materials that are widely available, but then you also choose what's allowed. But then you take a step back, then you got to build the machines that build those kit of parts. Then you got to design the machines to be able to fit into a container to become a mobile microfactory. So like it's like chipping away at the onion backwards. The plans or the construction drawings to our home, when submitted to a township somewhere in the US, do not cause a red flag. We are not Cuby the deep tech company. We look like a regular home. The only questions that someone might ask is like, wow, these guys are rich. They can afford to use steel and rivets for their framing, which typically folks use lumber. That's one. Two, we like SIP panels to enclose the home. Nothing about those things is not allowed. It's just slightly different. Everything else is all the same. But there's no regulation risk, nor if there was, like our system is pretty dynamic. So even in a single market that maybe is at odds with IBC, we can slightly tweak before a factory launches. So it's meant to be a dynamic system that's code compliant with today's building systems or building regulations.
I have a question. So, and this is a challenge that I run into even with my own business. If you imagine an engine with inputs and outputs, there's things we can control and things we can't control, right? So we can control things, we could automate, streamline certain things, and just kind of increase certain inputs that we can put into. But we're also kind of at the mercy of how these inputs are ultimately approved or reviewed. In your case, you're not just at the mercy of how quickly you can automate or streamline a particular system using hardware, software, labor forces, etc. But you're also at the mercy of just like literally local city governments and notoriously slow ones. Just to zoom out even outside of Cuby, how do you think about what governments are probably pillars of success? Which ones are doing it correctly? How do we get past the permitting process? Because it doesn't matter if we could build 1,000 homes. If we're approving one home a day, we're in the same spot.
So for us, that's why we're not trying to be a developer. I'll just start with us and then I'll zoom out. So generally, we want our customer to come to us once they have land that's permit ready to go build. Like that's when they come to the local factory to go offload whatever Cuby's outputs are, right? So that's why we want to be involved after they do that work because we don't want to be bottlenecked. That being said, like, yes, I think it's a bureaucratic issue. I think here's the positive if you zoom out. Doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. The one thing that everyone can agree on is that we're screwed when it comes to housing. I think a lot of folks in government have not yet taken economics and do not yet realize that adding supply alleviates pricing issues. But listen, I think regulation needs to exist because otherwise folks would be building random stuff that's falling over and damaging people. Like it's highly regulated the same way cars are highly regulated, right? Like it's mostly around safety. It's mostly around making sure that a strip club doesn't get built next to a school, right? Like I think there's ways to expedite it, to digitalize it. Like we want to be able to really quickly, within seconds, be able to produce everything from like a rough layout to pricing to a construction drawing within several clicks, as opposed to working your way through different third parties that otherwise would be doing this and charging a lot of money. And hopefully when you have construction drawings that work for that market, someone that's looking at them can look at them efficiently, know that the system works, etc. I don't know, frankly, how to speed up, someone that's about to retire sitting in, their local zoning municipality. Like approving draw. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think digitalization maybe, but can't really predict how to do that. I mean, there's definitely other sectors within the government where folks have tried or are trying. I'm not sure, frankly, the answer. I'm curious to get your thoughts too.
I don't know what the right answer is either. I think it has to be some sort of collaborative effort between all its stakeholders, right? It's not just the service providers and technology companies and developers and city governments, but I think acknowledging that we're all in the same race, that it's a relay race, and we all kind of play, kind of a role, a very important role in a kind of multi-part process. One of the things that keeps me up at night is that even, I mean, you're dealing with like greenfield, like how do we just build more? In my case, it's brownfield. Like how do we just understand what we currently already have? What's been concerning is that we've learned most building owners of existing buildings don't even know what they have. And so in the context of knowing what to do with these buildings is really difficult when you can't answer like what exactly is inside this thing. There's a lot of buildings out there. In my case, the question that I'm asking is how do we accurately understand what is inside buildings first before we can proactively then determine what we should do about it in efforts to then relay this information to the proper local city governments for approvals and permits?
I mean, what you're saying is probably more relevant today than ever, especially when you look at cities like New York City and you have a bunch of distressed office buildings, right, that need to be converted. And you obviously know I've spent a lot of time in that space, but like,
Yeah.
can't think of a more important reason as New York City's drafting different law to allow more conversions to understand what existing inventory is like to be able to know how and when and what to convert.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I could see you getting involved in some of that.
Yeah, I think some of the underlying themes is, and you mentioned this earlier, is that I think we just need more supply. Like at the end of the day, we're just not building enough. Whether or not you believe that some of it should be affordable or not, like I'm in the camp that we just need more, and we're not building enough of it. And naturally, once there's more supply, I think the market will continue to level out. I'm really excited about it. I mean, I think these are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. At personally rooting for you, and I think that just general housing. I think as a millennial, newly wed, man with a baby girl on the way, I think we would all benefit from, yeah, just having that at least the opportunity to own a home. I think given the lack of, it's for many become almost unattainable. So personally rooting for you. I guess last question for you is that, 5 years from now, paint us success. So let's assume we've addressed the city permit challenges. Let's assume cost of construction somehow stabilized, and let's assume your system is successful, and there's a bunch of different mini factories around the US and all over. What's it look like?
I think at that point, we'll have the leisure to focus on alternative materials. So sustainability is a big factor because in theory, folks that have developed interesting technologies around alternative concrete, steels, whatever, they don't yet have the proper conduit to spread those systems at scale. In theory, we could be the biggest conduit of alternative materials. I think that's interesting. And eventually we want to supply all materials to each mobile microfactory as a separate division. Like I said, eventually we want to be building homes directly to folks, different designs. Folks can go online, design directly, and that home gets put into production, then assembled on site. I think we'll layer on as a potential home builder things like insurance, services, so like ongoing efforts to make sure, like we want to be a home builder and all the different ways that home builders essentially monetize. We want to be able to do that. Yeah, I mean, listen, to get there is still far. I think just getting scale is the most important thing right now. But success is like, honestly, if we could look back, I mean, we want to be, call it the Toyota of housing, a highly durable, affordable, for the masses product. That's what we want to get to.
Alex, this has been super fun. For folks that want to follow your work, your company's work, where can they find you?
Yeah, no, just our website, Cuby, Cuby Technologies.com.
Love it. Can't wait for part 2.
Awesome. Thanks.